Nixon was already taking sleeping tablets. If Dilantin is taken in combination with these types of drugs or alcohol or in the wrong dose, the result can be devastating.
You're talking about creating a disastrous situation of mixing drugs that enhance their effect, not knowing what amount you took, not being aware of the safe amount, and then all the side effects that could occur, the delirium, psychosis, slurred speech, mental confusion.
As Election Day approached, rumors began to circulate that Nixon had been seeing a psychotherapist in New York. Reporters were soon on the trail of Dr. Hutschnecker.
John Ehrlichman confirmed to me before his recent death that he, with Haldeman, knew about Nixon's connection with the psychotherapist Hutschnecker, but were very concerned to minimize it. And as Hutschnecker himself put it, it was safer for a politician to be going to a whore than to be seen to be involved with a psychiatrist.
Nixon's press aide, Herb Klein, visited Hutschnecker to contain the story.
He told me that he had seen Nixon on a number of occasions. He'd come to Washington on some occasions. And that his concern, Nixon's concern, was depression, and that he was having trouble with insomnia.
I got in touch with Dr. Hutschnecker to try to interview him on this subject, and of course he wouldn't discuss Nixon per se, though he didn't deny having seen Nixon.
I think that we were ready with answering with the doctor saying that there was no psychological problem, which made it a small issue and short-lived.
But what he was at great pains to say was how important it was to have some kind of test or guidelines or notion of the emotional stability of our political leaders, and he was so impassioned about that that I read into that a concern about Nixon himself.
The press could not take the story any further, and Nixon went on to win the election by an extremely narrow margin. In January 1969, he was sworn into the most important and high-pressured job in the world.
Preserve, protect, and defend
the Constitution of the United States.
The Constitution of the United States.
So help you God.
So help me God.
Nixon's first term in office was dominated by America's involvement in the Vietnam War. At the beginning of May 1970, it led to a major political and personal crisis.
Comes out right. If it comes out right, that's what really matters.
Days after he had spoken of bombs blowing up campuses, 4 student anti-war protesters were shot dead by troops controlling chaotic demonstrations at Kent State University.
When all hell broke loose, that affected him deeply. He was under strain. We were all under strain. He had fewer friends than many, so he had to face a lot of it alone.
Thousands descended on Washington in protest.
That weekend, Washington was an occupied city, and we had buses ringing, I think, the White House and several other buildings for protective purposes.
On the 8th of May, President Nixon had a sleepless night. Between 9 p.m. and 2 a.m., he made 46 phone calls, including one to White House correspondent Nancy Dickerson.
Nixon's mood on the telephone was disturbing, as my mother later described it. On the one hand, he was questioning, halting, unsure of himself. The next minute, he was brave, in control. Another minute, he was happy and delighted. Another, sorrowful and sad. In the conversation, Nixon ranged all over the map. He talked about foreign policy, he talked about domestic policy, always circling back to those kids who were on the mall. He said, "I love those kids. I really do." And she said, "Well, why don't you go out and talk to them?" And he said, well, that's what I will do.
I was just in a state of absolute panic because he left the White House with a very small detail of Secret Service agents. And we just didn't have the capability to protect him if there had been any effort to move on his person.
Crowe pursued Nixon and his valet Manolo Sanchez to the Lincoln Memorial, where he found the president talking to a large group of students.
I think we're almost speechless. They could hardly believe that he was actually there.
We couldn't make sense of what he was saying, but we picked up after a while that he was giving like a tour of the world. He was mentioning various countries, you know, saying something about Prague, saying something about some cities in the United States. He just kept rambling, and he didn't cut off on one topic and then start another one. It was like his mind wasn't on anything at all. It was just like he was just going. He just kept going.
Then Nixon decided to take Manolo to the Capitol building and have the locked House chamber opened.
I remember going into the House chamber. I went up the stairs to look down from the balcony, and he was sitting on the front row, and he asked Manolo, who was his retainer, the person who was his valet, to go up and sit where the speaker would sit. And he said, well, say something, Manolo. And Manolo said something, and the president applauded. And I looked down on this tableau thinking, this is very bizarre.
Bob Haldeman wrote in his diary that Nixon is not getting enough sleep, is uptight, can be rough if another crisis arises because he's not ready to handle it. A few days later, Nixon flew down to rest at a friend's house in Florida. He needs it, wrote Haldeman. In Florida, he saw Dr. Hutschnecker.
At the time, as I recall, Hutschnecker told me that he'd been called down to B.B. Rabosa's place in Florida. And he went down there because he felt that Nixon needed him. Nixon couldn't turn to anybody else, even if he wanted to.
However finely tuned his nervous balance might be, at the end, he always got the situation under control.
4 months later, Nixon was again under pressure. Palestinian terrorists hijacked several aeroplanes and made them land in the desert in Jordan. Nixon made the questionable decision to retaliate by bombing a Jordanian airfield.
Conveniently, there was bad weather. I've always tried to carry out the orders of the Commander-in-Chief, but on some occasions, it was better to kind of protect him, too. And the bad weather just came about at the right time.
This was not the first time that excuses were made to avoid carrying out the president's orders. The year before, Palestinians had hijacked a passenger plane and flown it to the Syrian capital, Damascus.
Mr. Nixon apparently called Henry Kissinger, 3 o'clock in the morning. Henry, yes, Mr. President. And the president said, Henry, I want to set in motion plans for bombing of Damascus. This is an order. This is not something for discussion. He said, yes, Mr. President, I understand. Now, go back to sleep and I will set this in motion. So the president went back to sleep because nothing was done.
It was one of these things which he would probably have been horrified if it had been carried out. It was sort of posturing for people that he was with that evening.
In June 1972 came the event that would lead to Richard Nixon's downfall. Burglars linked to the White House were arrested in Democratic Party headquarters in the Watergate building. Within days, Nixon, Haldeman, and Ehrlichman embarked on a cover-up to protect the presidency. The incriminating conversations were captured on tape by the White House recording system. For a while, the cover-up succeeded, and in 1972, Nixon was re-elected with an overwhelming majority.